In 1853, in the quiet riverfront town of Davenport, Iowa, the Reverend Nathaniel Crew was seen descending the steps of St. Clement's Episcopal with his hands stained by a fine, reddish dust, the scent of rust clinging faintly to his black coat. Beneath the church's stone floor, masons had uncovered a narrow crypt, its air heavy with the smell of damp limestone, where an array of small gilt objects lay scattered, each wrapped in linen fragments. Marked with strange numerical inscriptions, parish records described Crew as a tireless advocate for public education and the poor, yet a ledger entry dated June 14th listed 12 of the artifacts as removed to safe custody, without identifying their location. At the time, the Mississippi was swollen from unseasonable rains, and freight along the levee moved sluggishly under low, humid skies. What compelled the Reverend to hide the crypt's contents? Reverend Nathaniel Crew was admired for his measured sermons and careful stewardship of the parish library, his pale eyes steady even in candlelight. Yet an 1857 vestry transcript noted repeated nocturnal entries into the church crypt, each lasting precisely 47 minutes, a pattern that demanded investigation as the decade darkened. The first sign that something was amiss came in the autumn of 1854, when a group of parishioners gathered in St. Clement's for an early Sunday service found the heavy oak door to the crypt ajar. The hinges groaned in the still morning air, and a thin draught of cold, mineral-laden air rose from below, carrying with it a faint metallic tang. Mrs. Margaret Tillman, who had cleaned the nave for nearly 20 years, claimed she saw a line of reddish dust scattered across the stone threshold, as if someone had dragged something small but weighty out into the church's main hall. The service that day began late, with Reverend Crew entering from the vestry rather than his usual procession from the nave, his cuffs faintly damp, a detail noted quietly among the older congregants. Davenport in those years was a growing city, with new brick buildings rising along the riverfront and steamboats docking daily under clouds of hissing steam. But within St. Clement's, change moved at a slower, more deliberate pace. The crypt had always been a subject of muted curiosity, believed to hold the remains of early benefactors and clergy, yet no one could recall any formal inventory. The first official mention in the vestry records after the 1853 discovery was a brief entry in November 1854. Certain items removed for safekeeping by the Reverend, no further inquiry to be made. This terse phrasing unsettled churchwarden Thomas Hale, who quietly recorded his own note in the margins, "Items not seen again, whereabouts unknown." By 1855, small rumors began to circulate among the congregation. The sacristan, an elderly man named Amos Wright, reported hearing movement in the crypt late at night while securing the church after evening meetings. He described the sound as deliberate, the scrape of something being slid across stone, followed by a muffled clink, as though metal touched against metal. He was not a man given to flights of imagination, and his account, quietly shared with two fellow wardens, lent a shadow to the otherwise placid life of the parish. On February the 2nd of that year, during an unusually harsh cold snap, a layer of frost formed on the inner side of the crypt door. The vestry minutes recorded the phenomenon without explanation, noting only that the matter was attended to by the Reverend in private. Yet in the same month, the parish financial ledger showed an unusual expense: the purchase of 2 iron-bound chests from a riverfront cooperative. No record stated what these chests contained or where they were stored. Neighbors to the church also began noticing subtle but unsettling changes. Mrs. Eleanor Price, who lived directly across from St. Clement's, claimed that some evenings, long after the lamps had been extinguished in the nave, a pale light could be seen flickering through the narrow basement windows. The light did not waver like candlelight, she insisted, but pulsed faintly, as if reflected off a moving surface. Others dismissed her claims as the tricks of moonlight on glass, yet she kept a small notebook in which she recorded each instance, noting the date, the hour, and the weather conditions. The year 1856 brought a quieter season to the city, but not to the church. That spring, a carpenter named Henry Lowell was hired to reinforce the crypt steps after one of the lower treads split underfoot. Lowell later told his wife he had been startled by the oppressive air below, describing it as thick with dust and something sharp to the nose, like scorched metal. When asked if he saw anything unusual, he hesitated before recounting how, in one far corner, behind stacked prayer stools, he glimpsed a narrow wooden crate wedged tightly into the wall. The crate bore no label, but a strip of linen with faded ink protruded from its edge. Reverend Crew, present during the repair, quickly stepped between Lowell and the crate, directing him to finish his work on the stairs without delay. By the summer of 1857, Reverend Crew's nocturnal visits to the crypt had become more frequent. Vestryman Hale, concerned by the growing secrecy, confronted the Reverend privately after an evening meeting. Hale later recounted that Crew's manner was cordial yet firm, his pale eyes fixed without blinking. "Certain matters," Crew said, "are better left in the stewardship of one entrusted." Hale noted the phrase in his own private diary, underlining it twice. The air within the church began to change as well. On particularly humid days, an odd acrid smell would seep into the sacristy, faint yet unmistakable, clinging to the fabric of the altar cloths. Wright, the sacristan, noticed tiny flecks of gilt dust on the flagstones near the vestry door on 2 separate occasions. When he mentioned it to Crew, the Reverend assured him it was merely debris from damaged hymnals, though Wright had never seen a book shed such particles. The first formal complaint reached the diocesan office in September 1858, signed anonymously but believed to be from a long-standing parish family. It accused the Reverend of removing objects of historic and sacred value from the church without the knowledge or consent of the vestry. No formal investigation followed, as the bishop's reply deferred entirely to Crew's exemplary record of service and unimpeachable moral standing. The matter was closed, at least officially. That winter, a heavy snowstorm left the streets of Davenport muffled in thick drifts. During the storm, Hale was tasked with checking the church's windows for damage. As he passed the crypt door, he felt a faint vibration beneath his feet, rhythmic and steady like the movement of a small hammer or chisel against stone. The sound stopped abruptly when he stepped closer. Upon mentioning it to Wright, the old sacristan only pursed his lips and shook his head, muttering that the crypt had been restless of late. In 1859, the city's river trade suffered from fluctuating water levels, and many local families faced financial strain. The church responded by organizing charity collections, yet a significant portion of donations was recorded in the ledger as unallocated, a vague term that appeared increasingly often. The amounts, while modest at first, grew noticeably larger by the year's end. On October 12th, a vestry meeting recorded the sudden decision to close the crypt to all but the Reverend himself, citing structural safety concerns. No inspection report accompanied the motion, and no repairs were commissioned. Margaret Tillman, now aging but still tending to the nave, recalled that in the weeks after the crypt's closure, Crew seemed quieter, moving through the church with deliberate, measured steps, his coat often dusted with a pale residue that left smudges on the dark wood of the pews. She once glimpsed him in the north transept, examining a small object cupped in his palm. When he noticed her, he closed his hand and slipped it into his coat pocket, with a swift motion that was out of character for the normally composed clergyman. The final incident before the escalation took a sharper turn occurred in early 1860. A young curate, newly assigned to assist Crew, was given the task of inventorying vestments stored in the lower vestry. In a drawer at the back, beneath folded surplices, he found a tightly rolled parchment bound with twine and sealed with red wax, bearing a design he did not recognize. The Reverend appeared within minutes, claiming the document was misfiled and taking it without explanation. The curate, unsettled, mentioned the episode in a letter to a friend in Chicago, a letter that survives in a private collection and stands as one of the earliest written accounts of Crew's guarded handling of certain items connected to the crypt. By the spring of 1861, whispers among the congregation had taken on a more urgent tone. Some feared theft, others believed the Reverend was protecting treasures from potential wartime unrest, as the nation's political climate grew tense and unpredictable. Yet the truth, as the scattered records and hesitant testimonies suggested, lay in a narrower, stranger realm, a steady removal of the past piece by piece into private keeping. The crypt, once a silent and seldom visited space, had become the pivot around which all quiet unease in St. Clement's now turned. The months following the curate's discovery of the sealed parchment brought a quiet shift in the way St. Clement's was used. The church still hosted its weekly services, weddings and funerals, yet more and more certain rooms were found locked without explanation. Parishioners accustomed to walking freely in the lower corridors now found themselves redirected, with Reverend Crew or his appointed sexton guiding them through narrow side doors rather than the main staircases. The key to the crypt was no longer kept on its peg in the vestry, but in Crew's own coat pocket. One evening in August 1861, a summer storm broke over Davenport, with a suddenness that startled even those accustomed to the river's volatile moods. Rain struck the stained-glass windows in rapid metallic bursts, and the wind whistled through the narrow gaps in the church's older frames. Inside, Amos Wright moved from window to window, checking the latches. When he reached the small pane that looked into the upper part of the crypt stairwell, he saw a glow below, steady, golden, as though a lamp was burning far under the stone floor. The sight might have been unremarkable had the church been in use, but the nave was empty, and Crew had been seen only an hour earlier leaving by the north gate. Wright stood watching until the light seemed to flicker and vanish, followed by the distinct scrape of something heavy shifting on stone. That same week, the church received a shipment from a St. Louis merchant specializing in ecclesiastical furnishings. The invoice, preserved in the vestry's accounts, listed 6 ornamental reliquary cases of a style uncommon in the Midwest. When questioned about them, Crew explained they were intended as gifts for an upcoming diocesan gathering, yet none were ever displayed or sent out, and no acknowledgement from the diocese appears in any correspondence. By early 1862, a few members of the congregation began meeting privately in the back room of a local tailor's shop to discuss what they called the question of the crypt. These were not idle gossips, but established townsfolk, merchants, clerks, and a former riverboat captain, each of whom had noticed irregularities in the Reverend's behavior or in the church's management of certain funds. One, a clerk named Robert Yates, had kept meticulous notes of offertory totals for nearly a decade. Comparing his older ledgers to recent years, he found that collections earmarked for repairs to the roof or replacement of hymnals often ended with the same vague annotation, "held in reserve." Meanwhile, physical traces of disturbance began appearing with greater frequency. Fine lines of dust traced the edges of the crypt door in the mornings, even on days when the building had been locked overnight. On one occasion, Mrs. Tillman noticed the faint imprint of a boot heel near the font, leaving a dry mark in a path otherwise damp from mopping. The heel had a narrow, almost pointed shape, unlike any she had seen worn by men in the congregation. In April of that year, as tensions in the nation grew toward open conflict, Crew made an unusual request to the vestry, permission to have the crypt's inner chamber sealed with a new iron gate, the cost to be covered entirely by him. Though the offer seemed generous, Hale objected, insisting that such alterations should be documented and overseen by the full vestry. Crew's response was measured, but carried an edge. He reminded them that certain contents of the crypt were best safeguarded from the hands of the curious. The matter passed by a narrow vote, and within a fortnight a local blacksmith had installed a tall barred gate inside the chamber's arched entrance. The installation brought with it more questions than answers. A blacksmith's apprentice delivering tools one morning claimed to have seen small bundles wrapped in pale cloth being transferred from the inner chamber to a side alcove, each bundle no larger than a man's forearm. When asked, the master blacksmith dismissed the story as youthful embellishment, but the apprentice maintained the detail years later. That summer, during a particularly humid spell, the church's stone floor began to show irregular discolorations near the altar rail. Pale stains appeared and faded within days, as though something had been dragged or set there briefly. No one could account for them. Wright, growing more uneasy, confided to Hale that the air in the crypt had changed again. "It is heavier now, sir. There is a taste to it, like the tang you get when biting on a coin." By October 1862, the group meeting at the tailor's had grown bolder. They resolved to write directly to the bishop, enclosing copies of Yates's financial comparisons and Hale's private notes. The letter was dispatched discreetly, but its reception was far from what they expected. The bishop's reply, courteous but curt, stated that he had spoken with Reverend Crew and was fully satisfied with his explanations. He urged the group to avoid discord and speculation in these troubled times. The war drew resources and attention away from Davenport, yet within St. Clement's, the sense of something concealed continued to build. That winter, the Mississippi froze in thick slabs and the church's windows glittered with ice at dawn. On one such morning, Yates arrived early to review ledger entries in the vestry. Passing the crypt stairs, he noticed the new iron gate was ajar, the lock hanging open. He descended cautiously, his breath clouding in the chill, and saw that the inner chamber was bare of any visible objects. The niches along the wall, once containing fragments of carved stone and small chests, stood empty. Before he could examine further, a sound from above, the measured tread of boots on the stair, drove him back to the main hall. Crew appeared moments later, smiling faintly, inquiring whether Yates had found the accounts in order. In the early months of 1863, another layer of secrecy was added. Crew began instructing that certain services be conducted in the evenings by lamplight, claiming the new schedule would better accommodate working families. These gatherings often ended later than planned, with the Reverend remaining in the building long after the last parishioner had gone. Wright, too old now to manage the late hours, was replaced for these services by a younger sexton who kept no written records. The change in atmosphere did not go unnoticed by the congregation. Conversations after services grew shorter, more guarded. The familiar creak of the crypt door, once an occasional sound, now seemed to echo through the nave more frequently, sometimes even during daylight hours when no one was thought to be below. The smell that accompanied these openings was no longer faint. It clung to the air with a sharper bite, mixing with the scent of old incense in a way that turned the stomach. It was in late March, as the river thawed and trade boats returned, that Mrs. Price across the street observed something she would later describe in careful, almost clinical detail. Shortly after midnight, she saw a cart arrive at the church's side gate, its wheels muffled with strips of cloth. Two figures, one certainly the Reverend, unloaded 3 long, narrow crates and carried them inside. The cart departed without lanterns, vanishing into the fog along the levee. She wrote the date and hour in her notebook, drawing a small mark in the margin to indicate the moon's phase. This was the point at which private suspicion began to edge toward action. Hale, Wright, and Yates agreed to meet inside the church after the following evening service, intending to search the crypt without the Reverend's knowledge. They arranged for Wright to keep the younger sexton occupied in the belfry, while Hale and Yates descended. The plan, however, never reached fruition. That night, the crypt door was not merely locked, but secured with a chain looped twice through its handles, the padlock new and polished. On the vestry table lay a single note in Crew's hand. "The crypt is under my sole charge until further notice. Your trust in this matter will be remembered." The restraint of those words only deepened their unease. Hale, returning home under a sky heavy with low clouds, could not shake the sense that the ground beneath the church now held not only the remains of the past, but a living secret, curated and guarded with a precision that excluded all others. The escalation had begun in earnest, though none of them yet knew how far it would reach. The first outsider to take an interest in the matter was a traveling correspondent named Edwin Latham, writing for a small but persistent weekly based in Chicago. Latham arrived in Davenport in early May 1863, ostensibly to cover the effects of wartime shortages on river commerce. His lodging at the Crescent Hotel placed him within sight of St. Clement's, and it was there, over dinner with a local merchant, that he first heard of the Reverend's locked vault. Latham's curiosity was sharpened by the merchant's description of the Reverend's recent nocturnal cart deliveries and the whispered claim that valuable relics were being moved without diocesan knowledge. Within days, Latham made discreet visits to the church, posing as a visiting parishioner. His first impression of Reverend Crew was of a man immaculately composed, his voice calm yet curiously measured, as though weighing each word for later scrutiny. Latham noted the Reverend's pale eyes, which seemed to linger a fraction too long on any question about the church's history. He also recorded, in the pages of his small leather notebook, the smell of cold metal that clung faintly to the vestry air, noticeable only when the crypt door was passed. Seeking corroboration, Latham interviewed Mrs. Price, who provided her meticulously kept notebook of observations. She offered dates, times, and weather notes for each unusual sighting. Her careful script lent weight to her claims, yet when Latham attempted to verify one particular night's activity by speaking to a watchman stationed near the levee, he was told flatly that no cart had entered the church grounds at that hour. The watchman insisted his patrol was thorough and suggested that Mrs. Price's account must be mistaken. This contradiction prompted Latham to approach the city's clerk's office in search of delivery permits or freight records tied to St. Clement's. There were none. Stranger still, the freight office's log for 2 of the dates in question contained irregular gaps, blank spaces where entries should have been, the handwriting above and below perfectly continuous. The clerk on duty, when asked, claimed he could not recall any omissions. By June, word of Latham's inquiries reached the diocesan office, which sent a canon, Father William Harcourt, to speak with Crewe. Harcourt was a deliberate man, known for his administrative rigor. In his later recollections, written in private correspondence, he described Crewe's hospitality as flawless. The tea properly steeped, the seating arranged to frame the sunlight through the nave windows. Yet he also remarked on an oddity: the Reverend's tendency to answer questions about the crypt, with long looping digressions into church history, never returning directly to the subject at hand. Harcourt was shown several reliquary cases, polished and ornate, but they were all empty. When asked why they contained no relics, Crewe explained that the items were under protection elsewhere due to the unsettled times. 2 days later, Harcourt attempted to revisit the church unannounced. He found the side gate locked and the sexton unwilling to admit him without prior arrangement. Harcourt's report to the bishop was measured but noted an excess of private control over parish property and recommended gentle but consistent oversight. The recommendation was quietly filed and, to Latham's frustration, not acted upon. Meanwhile, the internal tensions within Davenport began to sharpen. A former vestry member, known for his loyalty to Crewe, abruptly left town for St. Louis. His departure came just after a planned meeting between Hale, Yates, and Latham failed, when the vestry minutes they intended to show the journalist could not be found. The church's record cabinet, usually unlocked, was secured with a new brass lock, and Crewe claimed the missing minutes were in the process of reorganization. The summer heat pressed heavily over the city, thickening the air in the church to a point where incense seemed to linger for days. One afternoon in July, during a midday service, an unfamiliar man was seen seated alone in the rear pews, his eyes fixed on the crypt door rather than the altar. After the service, he was gone, leaving behind a faint smear of reddish dust on the pew rail. Wright found it later, touching it with a fingertip and noting the grit, like ground brick or oxidized metal. When he mentioned it to the Reverend, the reply was curt: "Leave it be." Latham, undeterred, decided to press his luck. One evening he lingered outside the church grounds, concealed in the shadow of a linden tree near the side gate. Shortly after 11, he saw a dim light appear in the crypt stairwell, then fade. 10 minutes later, Crewe emerged carrying a small covered box to the rear of the church, where a second figure, a man in a long coat, waited. They spoke briefly, too softly for words to carry, before the man took the box and departed toward the levee. Latham followed at a distance, but lost the trail in the fog near the wharf. The following morning, the levee records listed no departures during the night. Word of the journalist's activities began to circulate, and Crewe's manner toward him shifted from polite to watchful. In early August, Latham arrived for what he claimed would be his last interview. He asked plainly whether the crypt contained items of value removed from public record. Crewe's answer was slow and deliberate. "Every parish has its heritage. Mine is to ensure that heritage survives." When Latham pressed further, the Reverend rose, ending the conversation. Shortly thereafter, Latham received an unsigned note at his hotel, warning him to leave matters of the church to the church and advising his departure before the week was out. The handwriting, though carefully printed, bore certain shapes familiar from Hale's private diary. Latham could not prove the connection, but the implication unsettled him. In September, Father Harcourt returned unexpectedly, this time accompanied by a lay archivist from the diocesan office. Their aim was to conduct a formal inventory of parish property, but they were met with a claim that the crypt was temporarily inaccessible due to structural repairs. No evidence of such repairs could be seen, and the archivist noted the floors were entirely undisturbed. In his private notes, the archivist also recorded the presence of a faint rhythmic vibration underfoot while standing near the crypt, though no machinery was in operation. The archivist's draft inventory was sent to the diocesan office, yet by the time it was filed, several key descriptions were missing. The original draft, Harcourt insisted, contained references to empty display cases and anomalous storage of liturgical textiles, but these sections had been excised without explanation. No one admitted to altering the document. Autumn brought shorter days and longer shadows inside the nave. Yates, working late one evening to reconcile collection records, noticed a page missing from the ledger. The tear was clean, as though done with a blade. This was not the first time entries had vanished, but it was the first in which the missing page directly followed a large recorded donation. Yates copied the remaining figures before the book could be altered again, keeping the copy in his own home. The most jarring incident of the season occurred during a small weekday service when a loud metallic crash echoed from below the nave. The congregation froze, and Crewe, without missing a beat in the liturgy, simply raised his voice over the sound. Afterward, when asked, he claimed it had been a stack of folding chairs upset by a draft. Wright, however, found no chairs overturned, only a fine, fresh line of that same reddish dust along the base of the crypt door. Latham left Davenport in late October, his article never published. In later correspondence to a colleague, he admitted that too many details had been contradicted or erased to present a coherent account. "What remains," he wrote, "is a pattern, faint but deliberate, of concealment arranged by one man with absolute control over the space in question." The departure of the journalist did not end the unease. If anything, it allowed the matter to slide further into the realm of guarded suspicion, where each unexplained sound, each missing record, carried more weight. Crewe's presence seemed at once reassuring and impenetrable, his control of the crypt complete. The pattern of movement in and out of that sealed chamber continued, witnessed in fragments, never in full view, each occurrence deepening the quiet tension that now gripped St. Clement's. The year 1864 opened with a brittle cold that froze the riverbank solid and silenced the city's streets under a thin crust of snow. Inside St. Clement's, however, activity in and around the crypt seemed undiminished. Those few who lingered after evening services sometimes heard the muffled thud of crates being set down below, followed by the faint rattle of chains. The sound carried differently in winter, sharper, as if the stone itself was holding and returning it in fragments. On January 14th, a visiting deacon from Dubuque arrived to deliver a collection of hymnals donated by his parish. The deacon, a cautious man named Barrett, later told a confidant that upon entering the nave he found Reverend Crewe emerging from the crypt stairwell carrying a narrow, cloth-wrapped bundle. Crewe immediately redirected him to the sacristy, placing the bundle on a shelf high out of reach before closing the vestry door. Barrett thought no more of it until he noticed the faint residue on the hem of the Reverend's cassock, fine gold flecks that caught the dim light before falling away into the carpet. February brought an unusual request to the city's building inspector. Crewe applied for permission to reinforce the crypt's foundation, citing settling of the east wall. The inspector's report, however, recorded no sign of structural weakness. Instead, he noted unfamiliar fittings bolted into the stone near the far wall and a number of small linen-wrapped packages neatly stored in a locked side recess. When the inspector asked their purpose, Crewe replied only that they were archival in nature and not relevant to the inspection. The report was filed, but a second, more detailed version that the inspector claimed to have submitted never appeared in the city archives. It was in March that a new figure entered the unfolding pattern, Josephine Marsh, a correspondent for a religious gazette published in St. Paul. Marsh was not a casual visitor. Her work often focused on the preservation of religious artifacts and the integrity of parish archives. She arrived under the pretext of writing about the history of St. Clement's architecture, but quickly turned her attention to the locked crypt. Her first meeting with Crewe was cordial, yet she later wrote in her private journal that the Reverend's manner suggested a man who sees in every question the possibility of accusation. She was granted a tour of the nave, vestry and bell tower, but when she asked about the crypt, she was told it was unfit for visitors in its current condition. Marsh's method was patient. Over the next week, she sought out those who had worked in or around the church. A stonemason who had repaired a window in the south transept, a laundress who handled altar linens, and a carpenter who had replaced floorboards near the vestry. Each recounted small but consistent details: linen-wrapped bundles, the persistent metallic tang in the air, and the sight of Crewe alone in the church at odd hours. The laundress, in particular, recalled receiving linens stained with a reddish dust that did not wash out completely, leaving faint ochre smears even after repeated boiling. When Marsh attempted to corroborate her notes with parish financial records, she was told by the sexton that the ledgers were unavailable due to accounting revisions. On a subsequent visit, she found the vestry door locked and a faint rhythmic noise emanating from within, like the measured tapping of metal on stone. The sound ceased the moment her presence was noticed. By late spring, Hale and Yates, still quietly attentive to the church's affairs, were approached by Marsh for assistance. They provided her with fragments of earlier ledgers and Hale's private diary entries, though both men warned her that such material had a way of disappearing. Marsh began keeping duplicates of her notes in separate locations, aware that even trusted hands within the parish might not remain so. The more she learned, the more contradictions emerged. When asked, Crewe claimed the reliquary cases had been sent to the diocesan vaults for safekeeping. Yet an inquiry to the diocesan office returned a polite but clear denial. No such items had arrived. Similarly, the iron gate installed within the crypt was described by Crewe as a donation from a benefactor in Chicago, but no record of such a gift existed in the parish register. It was in early June that a moment occurred, which Marsh later referred to as the pivot. Arriving unannounced on a humid afternoon, she found the side gate open and no one in the nave. From the front, the crypt door appeared locked, but the air nearby was warm, carrying that now familiar metallic scent. Moving toward the south transept, she saw the Reverend in the shadows of the stairwell, speaking in low tones to an unidentified man. Between them, on the steps, rested a wooden chest with iron fittings. As Marsh watched from behind a pillar, the chest was lifted and carried toward the rear exit, leaving a narrow trail of reddish dust in its wake. By the time she stepped forward, both men and the chest were gone. Marsh wrote of this in her journal that night, noting the exact dimensions of the chest as best she could judge from her position. When she returned the next morning, the trail of dust had been swept, though traces remained in the grooves of the stone floor. She collected a small pinch of it into a folded scrap of paper, intending to have it examined in St. Paul. That sample, however, never reached her editor. It vanished from her room at the Crescent Hotel while she was at supper the following evening. July brought a sharper turn. The diocesan archivist who had visited with Harcourt months before sent a discreet letter to Marsh, having heard of her inquiries. In it, he admitted that sections of his inventory report had been altered without his consent. He enclosed a copy of his original notes, which described a series of objects of unknown purpose, possibly metallic, stored in conditions inconsistent with long-term preservation. The letter arrived sealed, but when Marsh opened it, she found that one of the 3 pages was missing. The archivist swore he had sent all 3. The summer heat deepened, making the air inside St. Clement's thick and slow. On certain days, the crypt seemed to exhale a breath of warmer air into the nave, as if something below retained and released the heat at will. Parishioners seated near the front pews whispered of a faint humming, barely perceptible, during the final hymns. Crewe dismissed these comments as the echo of the organ pipes settling. In late August, Marsh attempted to confront Crewe directly. She requested a formal interview on the matter of the crypt, bringing with her Hale, Yates, and 2 other parishioners as witnesses. The meeting took place in the vestry, where Crewe received them in his usual composed manner. He listened to their questions without interruption, then stated with finality that the crypt's contents were not the concern of those unprepared to bear the weight of their history. His tone was even, yet the implication of exclusion was unmistakable. The meeting ended without resolution, and the witnesses left with more unease than they had entered. Days later, Hale's home was broken into. Nothing of monetary value was taken, but his private diary, containing years of notes on the crypt and crew's activities, was missing. The lock on his desk had been forced, the wood splintered at the edge. No suspects were identified, and the city constable recorded the case as unresolved. By September, the strain was visible. The congregation's attendance began to thin, particularly among those who had supported the quiet inquiries. Crew's sermons, while still measured, took on a more insistent tone about obedience and trust. The younger sexton was seen more often near the crypt entrance, carrying keys and remaining close during services. The iron gate, once merely a barrier, now appeared to be kept locked at all times, even during the day. In her final weeks in Davenport, Marsh made one last attempt to gather testimony. She visited Mrs. Price, whose view of the side gate had given her a decade's worth of observations. Price shared her notebook in full, allowing Marsh to copy every page. It contained more than times and dates. It noted the varying sizes of crates, the weather conditions that seemed to accompany certain deliveries, and the frequency with which those events clustered around specific liturgical dates. But when Marsh boarded the train north in early October, she carried only her own copies, aware that any originals left in the city might not survive. In her journal, she wrote that the crypt was less a place of rest than a chamber of deliberate assembly, guarded by one who has ensured that truth is never seen whole. Her departure marked the end of external scrutiny for that season, leaving the quiet hum of concealed activity to resume without the interruption of outside eyes. Penseau pour 32s. The discovery began with a sound that did not belong in a place of prayer. On a grey morning after a night of steady rain, a dull crack travelled through the nave, followed by a tremor that set the hanging oil lamps to a small, clinking chatter. The stone near the north aisle had shifted imperceptibly, enough for Amos Wright to see a hairline seam open at the edge of the crypt stair. He stepped closer and felt a thread of air push upward against his palms, warmer than the chill of the church, carrying the smell of wet iron and linen that had been stored too long. He did not ring the sacristy bell. He went directly to Hale. By noon, a city inspector and the constable stood at the crypt door with Hale and Yates at their shoulders. Father Harcourt arrived soon after, coat damp at the cuffs, his expression carved into restraint. The chain that held the door was new and tight. The constable produced a key obtained through the magistrate and turned it with both hands. The lock released with a hollow clack that ran down the stairs and came back as a whisper. They descended single file, boots on stone, each footfall answering with a small echo. The air grew heavier with every step, thick with dust that turned the lantern beams into cones of floating motes. At the bottom, the iron gate waited, bars dark with oil, a second lock glistening where it had been polished by careful hands. The inspector touched the hinge and drew back immediately, as if surprised by warmth. He glanced at Harcourt. There was no prayer. The second key turned. The inner chamber opened not as a vault of reverence but as a room arranged for work. Tables had been set along the walls, plain boards on trestles, their surfaces dusted with a fine gilded powder that clung to the edges of paper like pollen. On the far wall, a narrow recess had been cut into the limestone and lined with bricks that did not match the rest. The lanterns made shallow shadows of the uneven mortar lines. To the right, a row of wooden chests stood on wedges, each fitted with iron corners and simple latches, each marked on the lid with numbers in a precise, slanting hand. No one spoke until the inspector lifted the latch on the first chest. The lid creaked, then settled back with the soft sigh of fabric moving against wood. Inside lay bundles wrapped in pale linen, tied with twine. The inspector loosened the first knot and unrolled the cloth with a care that made his fingers shake. A small gilded panel appeared, its surface dull with age where the gold leaf had thinned, its edges fitted with tiny clasps. Beside it, wrapped separately, were two narrow figures in metal, their faces stylized, their bases drilled with holes that suggested they had once been mounted. Each object bore a paper tag, handwritten with a date and a single word. Many read simply removed. Others named cities far from Davenport. Hale reached for one tag and read it aloud. June 14th, safe custody. The words were neat, unornamented, familiar to his eye from a dozen vestry notes. He lifted another bundle and found a cylindrical case of gilded wood with a glass window set into the cap. The window was empty. The tag read reliquary case unfilled. On the second table, instruments lay arranged on a folded cloth. Small chisels, a delicate saw, a brush stiff with residue, a spoon-blackened lamp with a wick cut short. Nearby sat a ledger bound in calfskin. Yates opened it, and the men stepped closer until their shoulders touched. The first pages held entries in the same slanting hand as the chest numbers. Each line contained a date, a description, a location, and a notation that might have been a sum. Davenport appeared only rarely. More often the locations named towns up and down the river. Some lines ended with words that turned the stomach with their coolness. Removed for preservation, removed for study, reserved. Harcourt's voice, when it finally came, was thin with control. Catalogue the room. Do not remove anything until it is listed. The constable nodded and drew a small notebook from his coat. The inspector moved to the row of chests, opening them one at a time. In the second chest he found narrow frames with traces of gold and pigment, their backs fitted with folded vellum slips. In the third, small metal fittings, too uniform to be random, sorted by size in little sacks tied and labelled. The fourth contained what at first looked like lengths of ribbon. He lifted one and discovered a linen strip with numbers carefully overwritten in ink, as if correcting an earlier hand. The strip was stiff, where a reddish dust had fused with the weave. The recess in the wall drew them last. The bricks were newer, their faces cleaner, the mortar paler against the surrounding stone. Yates saw that the alignment of the lower row was not quite true. He pressed his palm to one brick and felt a slight give. The inspector brought his chisel, set it to the mortar and tapped gently. The sound told a hollow behind the surface. 3 bricks came loose with a dull scrape. Their removal revealed the edge of a door of fitted wood, no thicker than a hand's breadth, set flush with stone. It had no handle, only a narrow slot along the edge. Hale's fingers slipped in and pulled. The door opened on a smaller chamber, not meant for visitors. The ceiling pressed low. Shelves of unfinished timber had been set against both sides, and on them sat bundles of linen arranged with an exactness that made the room feel like a counting house. Some were long, some no larger than a book, each with a tag. The smell here was not only metal and dust, but the dry sweetness of old cloth sealed from air. The inspector lifted one bundle from the lowest shelf, and its weight surprised him. He set it on the floor, untied the twine and peeled back the layers as if unwrapping a fragile instrument. What lay inside was bone, clean and pale, bound and packed with a care that hid nothing of its nature. The long bones had been wrapped separately and tied with string to prevent rattle. A tag lay against the cloth. It carried a date from the previous decade and a single word. Transfer. There was no blood. There was no grime beyond the dust of the room, yet the sight of human bone arranged like inventory pushed the breath from the men all the same. Yates swallowed audibly and turned away long enough to let his eyes find the wall. Harcourt knelt. He did not touch the bones. He read the tag again, then the shelf, then the next bundle on the next shelf. Each carried a similar tag. Some named places he knew in the diocese. A few bore no place, only a number and the word sealed. The constable met Hale's look and jerked his chin toward the door. He climbed back to the main chamber, hurried up the stairs, and sent a boy for the magistrate. His boots fell quickly, their sharp rhythms swallowed by the thickness of the air as soon as he passed below the nave. When he returned, he found the men where he had left them, except that Harcourt now leaned over the ledger with both hands splayed, reading as if the lines might rearrange under his gaze. The entries beside certain dates matched the tags. Beside others, small sums were noted in the margin. The sums were not large, they were consistent. They formed a pattern that measured the movement of objects and remains through hands that had assigned themselves the power to decide. Footsteps sounded on the stair above. They were steady and unhurried. Crewe appeared in the doorway of the chamber with one gloved hand resting lightly on the gate. He took in the lanterns, the open chests, the ledger on the table, the loosened bricks. His face did not color. He removed his glove with a slow precision and folded it once. Then he spoke. "You have opened what I have kept from decay." Harcourt's words came with effort. "You have opened the dead." The Reverend's gaze did not shift. They were already open. No one kept them. I kept them. Otherwise they would be scattered, lost to damp, and the names would vanish with them. Yates's hand closed over the edge of the ledger. He tapped a line with his finger. "This is a sum. What do you purchase with a sum beside a date and a bone?" The Reverend stepped forward until his shoes touched the dust of the rolled linen threads. He looked at the line and nodded, not at the accusation, but at the numbers, as if confirming a column. Paper, transport, iron fittings to hold what would otherwise fall. Things cost. Preservation costs. The inspector lifted another bundle from the hidden shelves and set it down. He untied it without ceremony. A skull lay within, wrapped in thin cloth around the crown and base, the jaw bound closed with a length of linen tape. A small hole had been drilled near the temple, not roughly, as if to pass a pin where a bracket might once have held it in place. The tag bore a date and a church 2 towns away. The inspector did not look at the Reverend. He spoke to Harcourt. "I need the magistrate here now." The muffled sound of voices above grew louder. The magistrate entered, cheeks flushed from the cold outside, followed by the constable and 2 men from the city office. He paused at the threshold and lifted his hand to his mouth, not for shock, but to avoid breathing dust. When he lowered it, his tone was even. "This is a church. I require order. Everyone stands where he is until the inventory matches this room." The next hours stretched with the measured work of the inevitable. Names were copied, tags were read aloud and repeated, dates spoken twice, once by the voice that lifted the bundle and once by the voice that wrote. Gilded fragments were set aside from bones. Cloths were shaken gently to free the dust that had settled into their creases. The inspector counted chests and found 2 with false bottoms. Within the concealed spaces lay small envelopes, holding chips of gold leaf and shavings of metal, each labelled by weight. The constable brought from the larger chamber a stack of letters tied with string. They were polite requests from collectors and scholars in distant cities, careful in their language, eager in their undertone. Some used the word acquire, some preferred receive. A few enclosed bank drafts. None addressed the diocese. All bore the Reverend's name in the salutations. As the lantern oil burned lower and the air turned thick with the smell of it, someone found a leather case beneath the tablecloth at the far end of the room. Inside lay a set of seal presses and wafers. Each press carried a device unfamiliar to any present. The wafers were red. Harcourt picked up one press and turned it in his hands without applying it to paper. He set it down as though it burned. From time to time, boots on the stairs announced another witness called down. The younger sexton came and stood at the wall, eyes fixed on the floor. The laundress, brought in to identify linens, recognized the faint ochre staining that had never washed out. She pressed her fingers to a strip and shook her head without speaking. The stonemason lifted his cap and scratched his scalp before nodding at the recess he had not noticed when he repaired the steps above. More than once, men turned away and pressed their palms to the cold stone to steady themselves. No one wept. The room had the gravity of a counting house closing its books on a day that could not be reconciled. The Reverend remained still, hands folded, watching with a patience that looked like certainty. At one point he reached for the ledger with a movement so calm it took a heartbeat to understand that he meant to lift it. Yates's hand was quicker. He flattened his palm on the page and met the Reverend's eyes. "Leave it," he said, and the words sounded worn smooth from hours of repetition, though he had only just spoken them. When the lists at last matched the room, the magistrate told the constable to seal the chests. Wax was melted and dripped at the corners. Paper seals were pressed and fixed to the lids. The hidden door in the recess was closed, the bricks stacked on the floor beside it like a row of teeth. The iron gate swung shut, and the key was turned twice. The air outside the chamber felt almost clean by comparison, though the dust had followed them up, clinging to cuffs and hair, marking them with a shimmer that felt like shame. They emerged into the nave as afternoon failed, and the grey light at the windows darkened to slate. Some of the men rubbed their hands as though to remove a residue that would not be removed. Harcourt stood apart, head bowed, lips moving not with prayer but with the slow act of naming, seeing whether the names would make a shape that allowed what they had seen to be held in the mind without breaking it. The magistrate wrote out his order at a small table, pen scratching, blotter lifted, paper turned and sanded, the simple rituals of ink and authority. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at the altar. He spoke to the constable in the same tone he would have used at the courthouse. The order was clear. The crypt and its contents were to remain sealed under civic custody until a formal ecclesiastical review could be convened. Crewe's expression did not change. He looked at the pulpit, then at the steps that led to the crypt, and then at the faces of the men who would testify to what they had found. When he finally spoke, his words were not loud. He said that neglect had been the first theft, and that what he had done to prevent the second. The magistrate did not answer. He folded the order, sand shaking from the paper like fine grit, and handed it to the constable. They left the church in a column that felt both ordinary and final, lanterns guttering in the damp wind that pushed through the north door as it opened. Outside, the rain had returned, thin and cold, needling the skin and turning breath to visible puffs. The bells did not ring. The nave behind them held the chill of a place where sounds had been weighed and measured and put away. Below, beneath iron and stone, the sealed room sat in its new stillness, full of objects that had been touched too many times. The night after the discovery, St. Clement's remained locked from nave to belfry, the constable stationed at the north door. The lamps in the street outside hissed in the rain, casting slow arcs of light across the wet stone. Inside, the air was a stagnant mix of incense residue and the metallic scent that had clung to the men's clothes hours earlier. The chests sat where they had been sealed, their wax impressions still soft enough to mark with a fingernail. By morning, word had travelled across the city in a thin, unbroken thread of rumour. Few knew the full extent of what lay below the church, but fragments of description were already being traded in shop fronts and boarding houses. Some spoke of relics from far-off parishes, others of remains without specifying their form. The tone was not of outrage, but of cautious distance, as if the matter belonged to a realm where questions could not be safely asked aloud. At mid-morning, the magistrate returned with a clerk and a locksmith. The task was to ensure that the crypt's locks could not be opened without civic oversight. The locksmith examined the gate and the door to the inner chamber before fitting new bolts and a hasp, the sound of his tools echoing up into the nave like measured hammer strokes on an empty hull. The magistrate stood by the vestry table, taking the names of everyone present. Harcourt remained at his side, his coat buttoned high, his gloved hands clasped as though holding an invisible ledger. Crewe entered while the locksmith worked. His steps were unhurried, his gaze steady, taking in the faces, the tools, the clerk's ink-stained fingers. He did not ask for the key. Instead, he moved to the first pew, rested his hands on its polished back, and watched the men finish their work. When the final bolt was driven into place, he spoke to the magistrate in a tone almost conversational. "Locks," he said, "are for the living. The dead keep no gates." The magistrate gave no reply. He only motioned for the clerk to write the new key's custody into the record. The constable pocketed it, and the crypt was left in silence again. By early afternoon, the diocesan office had sent word that a formal commission would travel from Des Moines to examine the contents under ecclesiastical authority. Until then, no item was to be moved. The commission's arrival was expected within the week, but for Hale, Yates, and the others who had seen the shelves in the recess, each day felt weighted with the possibility that absence could replace presence at any moment. That evening, Hale returned to the church with the constable's permission to collect hymnals for the next morning's service. The nave was dim, the light from his lantern sweeping the floor in wide arcs. As he passed the crypt stairs, he stopped. The faintest sound reached him, no more than a breath of air shifting through a narrow space. It was not the weight of boots or the scrape of wood, but it had the cadence of something alive. He leaned close to the door, listening. The sound ceased, replaced by the echo of his own breathing. He stepped back, leaving the hymnals where they were, unwilling to pass that threshold again without others present. The next day, the commission's arrival was delayed by heavy rains upriver. Messages were sent and returned, each bearing new estimates of their travel time. In their absence, Harcourt oversaw a second written inventory, matching the magistrate's notes with his own. This time the descriptions were more exact. Measurements of each object were taken, the materials noted, any markings copied into the ledger. When they reached the bundles of bones, the entries grew clinical. Tibia, length 16 inches, linen wrap, ochre stain. Skull, drilled aperture at right temple, jaw bound. The work was methodical, the voices low. Crewe did not attend the second inventory. Instead, he was seen in the rectory garden, pruning the narrow hedge that bordered the path to the street. The rhythm of the shears was steady, precise, like the ticks of a metronome marking time in a room where music had long since ceased. On the fourth day after the discovery, the constable on watch swore he saw light in the crypt. It was a thin gold thread spilling from beneath the iron gate, flickering as though reflected off something in motion. He descended 2 steps before stopping, the key in his hand, uncertain whether to open the door. The light vanished before he decided, leaving only the cold smell of stone. When he reported it to the magistrate the next morning, the account was written in the daybook without comment. By the time the commission arrived, the air in the nave felt heavier, as though the days of closed windows and unlit lamps had settled into the mortar. 3 men and 1 woman stepped inside, their travel cloaks shedding a fine spray of rainwater onto the aisle runner. The leader, an older canon with a narrow face, greeted Harcourt with a brief clasp of hands before turning to the magistrate for the key. The descent into the crypt began with formal prayers, spoken more for the record than for comfort. The bolts were drawn back, the gate swung open, and the lanterns lit the space once more. The commission moved slowly, pausing at each chest, each shelf, each tagged bundle. Their questions were direct. Was this taken with permission? Is this recorded in the parish register? Where is the corresponding artifact for this reliquary? Crewe, standing in the doorway, answered in sentences that gave nothing beyond what was asked. At the recess, the canon stooped to examine the replaced bricks. They had been stacked neatly after the first inspection, but not mortared. He removed them one by one until the wooden door appeared. When it opened, the air that came out was warmer still, smelling faintly of wax and the dryness of cloth untouched by fresh air. The bundles lay as before, but now, under the commission's eyes, their arrangement looked less like order and more like possession. The woman among them, an archivist, unwrapped 1 bundle slowly, tracing her fingers over the tag before lifting the linen. Her breath caught, and for a moment the room was silent except for the faint hiss of the lanterns. She looked at Crewe. This was taken from St. Anselm's in Galena. The record says it was interred. Crewe's reply was quiet. The record is wrong. The archivist folded the linen back over the bone and replaced it on the shelf without another word. The inspection stretched into evening. Each item was noted, each absence marked. 2 tags bore dates from before Crewe's tenure, but the handwriting matched his. When this was pointed out, he said only that the earlier records were incomplete and needed correction. The canon wrote that explanation beside the entry, his pen leaving a long stroke on the page. By the time they finished, the light outside had dimmed to the blue of rain-heavy dusk. The commission stepped back into the nave. The ledger closed, the crypt sealed again. Harcourt and the magistrate conferred briefly at the vestry table, then left without announcing any conclusion. Crewe followed them to the door, pausing to look back at the pews as if committing their arrangement to memory. That night, the constable on watch swore he heard footsteps in the nave long after it had been locked. They were slow, deliberate, moving from the altar to the crypt stairs and back again. When he searched the building by lantern, he found no one. The dust near the crypt door was disturbed in a faint arc, as though someone had stood close enough to touch the lock, but not open it. The commission's report would take weeks to compile, but in the days that followed their visit, the church seemed suspended between 2 states, the formal quiet of a place awaiting judgment and the restless silence of something unfinished below. Hale avoided the crypt stairs entirely, choosing longer routes through the nave rather than past the door. Yates, who had copied the first inventory, began keeping his notes at home rather than in the vestry. Harcourt remained in Davenport, attending each service with an expression that betrayed nothing, yet his eyes drifted often toward the north aisle. As for Crewe, his presence in the parish did not diminish. He continued his duties with the same precision as before, visiting the sick, overseeing the library, delivering sermons without tremor in his voice. But those who had stood in the crypt with him noticed something altered in the way he carried his hands, less idle clasping, more the measured placement of fingers on wood, on rail, on the backs of pews, as if confirming the firmness of each surface. The crypt remained locked, the key under civic seal, but the thought of it, its shelves, its chests, its uncorrected records, hung in the minds of all who knew what had been seen there. The confrontation had taken place in the lantern-lit air below the nave, yet its echo was in the stillness above, in the moments between footsteps, in the small awareness of dust in a sunbeam where none should have been. The Commission's conclusions arrived in early winter, carried in sealed packets to the magistrate, the diocesan office, and the parish vestry. Their language was restrained and exact. They affirmed the presence of human remains and ecclesiastical objects stored without public register. They noted the absence of diocesan approvals for removals. They cited irregular entries in the parish accounts. Nowhere did the report accuse criminal intent. Instead, it recommended civic action to secure the crypt and ecclesiastical censure for failures of governance. The words were measured. The effect was immediate. Within a week, the magistrate issued an order placing the crypt under municipal seal until the end of a formal inquiry. 2 constables kept a rotating watch at the north door. The key to the iron gate was transferred to a small safe in the clerk's office, its custody recorded in a ledger with a clean, square hand. At the same time, the bishop announced that Reverend Crew was suspended from pastoral duties pending a church court. He was not removed from the rectory, but he no longer entered the pulpit, and his presence in the nave was as a man among pews rather than at the altar. He attended services in silence, a thin scarf at his throat against the cold, his hands folded in the same careful way that had marked his work below. The civic inquiry convened in the courthouse on a series of dim afternoons when the light slanted through the tall windows and caught the dust raised by boot soles on the worn floorboards. Witnesses were called. Hale spoke in a steady tone, his eyes fixed on the clerk's quill as it scratched the record. Yates brought copies of his ledgers. The laundress described the ochre that never washed clean. The stonemason drew a rough diagram of the recess with the uneven mortar lines. Father Harcourt's testimony was brief and precise. He repeated the Commission's finding that objects and remains had been kept without proper authorization. He did not speculate beyond his documentation. Crew appeared on the 3rd day. He wore his clerical coat, polished but plain. His voice was even. He did not contest the presence of the chests or the arrangement of the shelves. He stated that the remains had been preserved from places where churchyards had been disturbed by new construction or neglect, that the gilded fragments had been recovered from collapsing altars, that the tags corrected. Incomplete records. When asked why the diocese had not been notified, he said that the diocese had been slow to act in other matters, and that delay risked loss. The inquiry board asked if any items had been sold. He answered that certain duplicates of fittings had been exchanged to pay for iron, paper, and transport. He used the word exchange again when the magistrate said sale. The board retired for 2 hours. When they returned, they delivered a decision that was at once stern and cautious. They found that civic law concerning burial and disinterment had been breached. They noted that no evidence had been presented of personal enrichment. They recommended that the state attorney pursue misdemeanor charges related to unlawful removal without permit. The magistrate accepted the recommendation and set a date for arraignment. He also ordered that the crypt contents remain in place until ownership and origin could be traced, after which they were to be returned or reinterred according to diocesan direction. The church court convened soon after, held not in Davenport, but in a larger parish hall downriver, to avoid the complications of proximity. The proceedings were ecclesiastical, not civil. They concerned doctrine, duty, and obedience to canon. The charges were stated in unadorned terms: unauthorized custody of sacred objects, misrepresentation in parish records, failure to seek oversight in matters of burial. The court heard many of the same witnesses, though the tone was different. Here the questions circled around intention. The bishop, grave and composed, spoke of trust. He did not raise his voice. The outcome came in a terse judgment. The court stripped Crew of his license to officiate. It forbade him from holding any position of stewardship over objects or archives. It required him to submit the ledger and any correspondence related to exchanges to the diocesan archivist. It did not expel him from the church. He was described as a man who had claimed too much authority rather than as a thief. The sentence carried the weight of exclusion. It also left him in Davenport without a pulpit, a presence now defined by its removal from office rather than by public disgrace. The civil case followed its own course. The state attorney proceeded with a limited indictment on counts tied to specific dates where the ledgers matched missing permits. The trial was brief. The verdict was guilty on 2 counts. The sentence was a fine and a public admonition entered into the city record. There was no imprisonment. The law was clear on paper. It was less certain in a city where churchmen were also neighbors. The fine was paid by an anonymous donor whose handwriting on the receipt resembled the measured script of a shopkeeper near the levee. In the months after the judgments, work began to undo or secure what had been done. The commission and the diocesan archivist drafted a plan to return items that could be traced and to re-enter remains with the prayers that had not been spoken when they were first removed. This labor was calm and slow. It required the crossing of letters between parishes, the comparing of tags to book entries, the reading of faded annotations by lamp. In some cases, the way back was clear. A reliquary case with a Latin inscription found its companion record in a register from a town upriver, and the empty case returned to the altar that had once held it. In other cases, the path was obscured by gaps. A bundle labeled only with a number and the word sealed could not be tied to any single place. These were reinterred in a small plot near the churchyard with a simple marker, the names uncarved because they were unknown. The ground took them back without ceremony beyond the presence of the archivist and Harcourt, who spoke the prayers in an even voice that carried without echo in the winter air. St. Clement's remained closed for a season while the work proceeded. The nave was cleaned twice. The pews were wiped with oil. The altar cloths were boiled and dried. The iron gate to the crypt was left in place, but the door to the inner chamber was removed. The recess bricked solid and plastered, its line beneath the plaster barely visible as a faint smoothness against the pitted wall. A new rector arrived in the spring, a younger man with a voice that filled the church without effort, and a manner that kept him always in sight of his wardens. He preached often about measure and memory. He did not mention the crypt. The parish adapted. Attendance rose again, then settled into steady numbers. Collections paid for repairs to the roof that had been postponed. The library reopened with a public catalogue, copied into neat handbills and distributed to parish families. Children began to sing again at the front on feast days. The routine actions of a church resumed their shape, and the heavy stillness that had pressed on the space during the inquiry lifted enough that the smell of oil and polish replaced the memory of iron and dust. Beyond the parish, the case left a mark that was less visible but more durable. The diocese issued new directives that required written permits for the movement of any artifact or remains, even within a parish property. A rotating committee of lay members was created to audit parish ledgers and inventories quarterly. The audits were conducted quietly, their notes kept in a consistent format that resisted alteration. In the city offices, the clerk added a second signature line to the register for permits affecting churchyards. One signature was for the applicant, the other was for the diocesan representative. Such small devices of ink and paper measure the memory of what laws alone do not hold. Crew did not leave Davenport. He moved from the rectory to a modest boarding house near the edge of the market square. He kept to a routine that resembled his old one in shape, if not in purpose. He visited the sick in the hospital. He read in the public room by a window that overlooked the street. He walked by the river in the early mornings, hands clasped behind his back, the sleeves of his coat shiny at the elbows. Some greeted him, others turned away with a studied neutrality that avoided both pity and blame. He wrote letters. Their recipients were not known. He kept no visible collections. He attended services as a congregant and did not look toward the crypt stairs. In the years that followed, the city grew. New brick buildings lined the streets near the courthouse. The levee saw more steamers, then fewer, as traffic shifted. A cemetery opened on higher ground at the city's edge, and the old churchyard ceased to receive burials. The parish records filled with baptisms, marriages, and the slow catalogue of lives measured in ordinary lines. The ledger entries for St. Clement's acquired a regularity that might have been dull if one did not know the cost of irregularity. People who had seen the sheets of linen with the tags did not speak of them often. When they did, their voices took on the tone used for detailing a weather event from a distant year. The facts were recounted with care, but the feeling remained withheld, as if the telling might reopen a space that had been sealed, not in the wall, but in the mind. Newcomers learned only that the crypt was closed and that the parish kept a strong archive. Children were told that the church was old, and that old buildings have rooms that are not used. Hale died first. His papers passed to a nephew who stored them in a box beneath a bed, where they gathered a dry smell of cedar and ink. Yates moved upriver and worked as a bookkeeper until his eyes failed. The laundress retired to a small house with a garden and lived long enough to see electric lights come to the main street. Harcourt returned to his administrative work, rising quietly in the diocesan offices until his hair was the color of the paper he handled. Crewe aged in place. He grew thinner, his clothes hanging with the careful economy of a man who does not replace what can be mended. He walked a little more slowly along the river, but with the same direction. He died in 1888, after a brief illness. The record of his burial takes 3 lines and ends with the word interred. After his death, a second inquiry was suggested by a new generation of clergy who had not lived the first. The idea was set aside. The archive was considered sufficient, the directives in force, the lesson absorbed into habit. Yet from time to time a visitor asked why the crypt remained sealed. The answer was simple and true. It was sealed by order. The visitor might accept this and move on, or he might glance toward the north aisle as if expecting to hear the sound of a hinge that had not turned in years. The legacy of the case rested less in the inventory sheets than in the way hands paused before lifting an old object, in the reflex to ask where a thing came from and who had the right to move it, in the quiet understanding that the past is not a place for private custody when a community believes it belongs to them in common. That understanding settled over St. Clement's like a surface of polish that must be renewed by use, not left to harden into a shell. The crypt remained part of the building, present on every plan, absent from every tour. The iron gate did not rust through. Its lock was changed as keys changed hands. On certain afternoons, when the light fell through the high windows at an angle that made the dust visible in slow curtains, an older parishioner might stop and watch the motes travel across the aisle and remember that those tiny glittering specks once felt heavier than air. If the wind caught the door to the north aisle and made it thud against its frame, a few heads would turn without speaking, a reflex shared by people who had once held their breath in a room where names were spoken twice so that the record would not be lost. It is said that the nave feels calmer now than in those years, though someone always asks, in a voice kept to a whisper, whether calm can be trusted when the key to the past still fits thee. Locket was made to turn. The years after Crewe's death allowed the details of the case to retreat from active memory, yet the shape of it lingered in the habits of those who remained. Parish meetings always began with the reading of the inventory, even when nothing had changed since the last quarter. Keys were handed over with a witness present, signatures in 2 inks, recorded in the same neat columns. The crypt was not spoken of in sermons, but its existence was part of the parish's unspoken map. Children learned early that the north aisle was a place to pass through quietly. The municipal seal on the crypt's gate was renewed every 5 years in a brief, formal act. A clerk and a constable descended the stairs, confirmed the integrity of the lock and bolts, and pressed fresh wax over the join of the hasp. The wax was stamped, the stamp recorded, and the men left without opening the gate. The air at the bottom of the stairs was always cooler, and the sound of their boots returned in a faint echo that seemed to come from farther than the chamber itself. In 1890, 2 years after Crewe's burial, the diocesan archivist proposed transferring the crypt's contents to a central vault in Des Moines. The motion was met with polite resistance from the parish, who claimed the process of removal would damage what remained. The archivist relented, noting in his report that The items are secure where they are, and the community appears to have accepted their permanence in situ. It was an unusual decision for a body that favored consolidation, but it allowed the crypt to remain untouched. The plot where the unidentified remains had been reinterred was tended without ceremony. A parishioner would cut the grass there once a month in summer, clear the leaves in autumn, and place a small pine bough in winter. No names were carved on the stone, but a faint groove from weathering traced the outline of the uncut letters. Visitors sometimes paused there, without knowing why the ground was different from the rest. By the mid-1890s, St. Clement's had seen 2 more rectors, each serving without incident. Their ledgers were tidy, their records intact. The library catalogue remained open to inspection, and the parish archives were kept in a locked cabinet whose key hung in the vestry where anyone might see it. The memory of the sealed chamber had faded for many, but those who had lived through the inquiry carried its weight in their tone when speaking of stewardship. They did not speak of Crewe with bitterness or admiration, but with the kind of measured pause reserved for a story that does not fit comfortably into either praise or condemnation. A single photograph of Crewe survived in the vestry drawers, taken years before the inquiry. He is seated at a desk, the light from a high window falling across the neat lines of paper before him. His eyes are on the page, his hands resting on either side of it, as though to steady it against some unseen movement. The photograph was never displayed, but it was not destroyed. It lay beneath the current rector's correspondence, its edges softened by handling, its surface marked with a faint trace of dust that resisted every attempt to wipe it away. The diocesan files kept their own copy of the Commission's report, stored in a drawer that also contained the original inventory sheets. The handwriting on those sheets was still clear, the ink dark, the measurements precise. Besides certain entries, the notes in the margin had been underlined in red at some later date, as if someone had returned to them with a question in mind. The archivists who opened that drawer did so rarely, and when they closed it, they always replaced the key in the same position on its hook. Among the parish, the case settled into the form of a caution. It was not told as a scandal, but as a reminder that even in a place of trust, the line between preservation and possession can blur. The caution was quiet, embedded in the way new wardens were taught to read the ledgers, in the habit of cross-checking every object against its last entry, in the practice of writing every transfer in duplicate. These were not burdens, but the routine weight of care. In the market square, the boarding house where Crewe had lived his final years stood until the end of the century. Its shutters were painted a dull green, its roof patched in mismatched slate. After his death, his small room had been let to other tenants, but none stayed long, not for reasons they could name. Some spoke of the way the light fell there in the mornings, thin and cold even in summer, or of the quiet that seemed to press close at night. Others said nothing at all. When the building was finally torn down, the workmen found only the ordinary remains of habitation: nails in the wall, a few buttons in the dust under the floorboards, a scrap of paper with half a line of scripture in a hand that matched the old parish ledgers. By the close of the century, those who had first stood in the crypt were gone. Their papers, if kept, were scattered into attics or given to descendants who did not know the story. The city had grown, its streets busier, its attention turned to the noise of new industry. Yet the crypt remained sealed, its gate and lock unchanged, its presence marked in the parish records with the same brief note renewed each year. Secured, contents unaltered. From time to time, a visiting clergyman or historian asked to see it. The rector would explain the municipal seal, the agreement with the diocese, the fact that opening it required more than local consent. Most visitors accepted the explanation. A few lingered at the top of the stairs, looking down into the dim space where the gate bars caught the light, and then walked away with a glance over the shoulder, as though expecting to see movement in the stillness. One autumn afternoon in 1899, as the last leaves gathered in the corners of the churchyard, a young seminarian assigned briefly to St. Clement's was given the task of cleaning the north aisle. In the process, he found himself standing before the crypt stairs, the gate visible below. He paused, listening. There was no sound, no draught of air, only the faint scent of stone and oil from the ironwork. Yet he later told a friend that in that moment he felt as though the space behind the gate was not empty, but waiting. not for an opening of locks, but for a question precise enough to pass whatever guarded it. He did not go down. He swept the aisle and left, but he returned to the spot twice more before his assignment ended, each time without speaking of it to anyone in the parish. The key to the crypt still fit the lock. It had never been changed, only moved between hands whose names were recorded in ledgers that would, in time, also pass to others. The wax seals were renewed, the inventories left untouched. The north aisle kept its stillness. The recess behind the bricked wall kept its contents in the dark. And the church kept its silence, not because it had forgotten, but because it had learned that some things remain more securely in place when the telling of them is left unfinished. If this story moved you, if you made it to the end, it's because you also feel that these hidden truths must come to light. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. That way, we'll know how far these stories reach, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering them. This story was reconstructed from documents that were found. All names have been changed to protect the source.